Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses as we continue with Part 12, The Five Orders of Architecture, from the Freemason's Manual, or Illustrations of Masonry by Jeremiah Howe. The Five Orders of Architecture: the Doric, the Ionic, the Corinthian, the Tuscan, the Composite. Chapter 12, The Five Orders of Architecture. First unadorned and nobly plain, the manly Doric rose. The Ionic then, with decent matron grace, her airy pillar heaved, luxuriant last. The rich Corinthian spread her wanton wreath. Associated as the symbolic degrees are with the building of the house of God at Jerusalem, and our allegorical instruction in the tools used by operative masons, our lectures from the earliest time have ever required some explanation of the different styles of architecture. Architecture is sometimes defined to be the art of building, and we find the Greek term architekton is employed by Herodotus as the word architect is now. He says, Rhoecus, a Samian, was the architecton of the great temple of Samos, built BC 986. Leaving out of our inquiry the earlier constructions, such mounds of earth as that of Aliates or of Silbury Hill, or those remarkable monuments like Stonehenge, we briefly notice the characteristics that distinguish the different styles of architecture. Egyptian architecture is so purely monumental or historical as to be of little use to the student. Presuming that the pyramids are of a date long prior to any other structures now existing, we find at the entrance to the Great Pyramid a proof that the method of constructing an arch was known to these people, as four enormous masses of stone, placed thus, support the stupendous pile of rude stones, which are laid in without order above. These masses, as far as can be judged by comparison, are not less than 25 feet by 12. At Thebes, there are arches formed of 4 courses of bricks. Some writers have claimed for the Etruscans the invention of the arch. It is found in their sepulchral monuments, gates, etc. The date of these people is, however, only about 6 centuries before Christ, whereas the Great Pyramid was constructed above 300 years earlier, according to the account of Herodotus. These wondrous structures, the pyramids as well as the temples in Egypt, which are astounding both for their gigantic vastness and the prodigious solidity of the materials and mode of construction employed, are, to the eye accustomed to Grecian and modern architecture, utterly devoid of beauty of proportion and uncouthly sublime. Of the immensity of all the structures of the ancient Egyptians, we only notice the vast hall of Karnak, which is 340 feet by 170 in extent. It has 134 columns disposed in 9 parallel rows one way and 16 the other, the smaller pillars being 9 feet in diameter and the larger 11 feet. In comparison with such enormous dimensions in every respect, for the whole structure extended several thousand feet, all other works of ancient and modern architecture shrink into insignificance. There appears, as far as we can judge, one peculiarity which identifies Egyptian architecture with that of the Israelites. Before the temple were placed a pair of colossal pillars or obelisks. Of Jewish art or architecture, beyond the descriptions of the books of Kings and Chronicles, the sole memorials in existence are the sculptured transcripts on the Arch of Titus at Rome. But every description in the sacred records, from the calf of the wilderness to the 12 oxen of the molten sea, or the lions of the throne of Solomon, these latter, the work of our master Hiram, evinces the taste of the former bondsmen of Pharaoh. In Egypt, a country destitute of wood, even the most ancient erections are of stone and were in imitation of the natural caves in which the rude inhabitant had sought a wretched shelter. In Asia, the land of the Israelites, wood was abundant, and accordingly we find from the descriptions in Holy Writ that this material was much employed in the most sacred and important buildings. For though few details capable of giving any just architectural notions are preserved of Solomon's temple, it is plain that cedar wood was the chief material both for roof and columns, that is, for supported and supporting members. Hence the temples of Palestine were less durable than those of Egypt. Of this we have a striking proof in the house of Dagon, which was wholly overturned by Samson pulling down 2 pillars. Of course, such a catastrophe could not have occurred with a structure of stone. In the oldest ruin existing in Asia, Persepolis, The marble columns evidently bear marks of having been connected with cross beams of wood and doubtless supported a roof of the same material. Hence the easy conflagration of this abode of the Persian kings in a debauch of Alexander. Without further speculation on the styles of architecture of other ancient nations as Babylonian or Hindu, we shall enter on a rather brief description of the science of architecture, as first framed by the Greeks and afterwards enlarged by the Romans. We first describe architecture according to the scientific arrangement accepted by artists of all countries, and the height of the columns according to the universal mode. This is followed by noticing the most remarkable samples of the orders whose remains exist, and we close our narration by a popular account chiefly derived from Brother Preston. Orders in architecture. What is termed an order consists of two principal divisions, the column and the entablature, that is the upright support and the horizontal mass supported by it, the former being divided into base, shaft and capital, except in the Doric order where the shaft rests immediately upon the flooring, the latter also into three parts, architrave, frieze and cornice. These together constitute an order which is further distinguished as belonging either to the Doric or Tonic or Tuscan or Corinthian or Composite. Of the Doric there are two kinds. The Greek, the column of which is generally executed without a base. The flutings of the shaft are 20 in number, very shallow and without fillets. But some examples are fluted only at the upper and lower extremities. The capital consists of a solid-looking abacus, the uppermost member without a moulding but supported by a very elegant echinus moulding, which swells gradually out of the line of the shaft, having three annulets or rings at the bottom. The features of the entablature are very simple, being plain and without ornament. The triglyphs are invariably placed over the center line of the column, except the columns at the angles, when the triglyphs form the extremity of the frieze. Other triglyphs are placed in the center between those before mentioned. The Roman Doric base is sometimes only a simple fillet. The shaft springs from it by a small curve, as at others it consists of a square plinth, a torus moulding and fillet, from which the shaft springs in like manner. The shaft is terminated by a neck moulding composed of a fillet and astragal, a small ring moulding. And from this springs the capital, commencing with a neck sometimes enriched with pateras and buds. The architrave consists of one or more plain faces separated from the frieze above, with gutta under the triglyph. The frieze is divided into compartments by a triglyph over each column and one or more between, according to the width between them. The cornice completes the order, of which the principal features are a cavetto or hollow, on a chyma recta, a corona and bed moulding on the frieze, all of which are enriched or plain. There are sundry minor details which are not needed in our description. The Tuscan order, which is simple in its design, has a base formed of a plinth or squared piece of stone as a foundation, and a torus above it surmounted with a fillet. The architrave is a plain face with a broad fillet. The frieze also is a plain face. The cornice consists of an ogee, a fillet, an ovolo, forming the bed mold of the cornice, which consists also of the corona and fillet, surmounted by a cymatium. The Ionic has an Attic base. The flutings of the shaft are 24 in number with fillets. The capital is distinguished by being formed with two volutes, a kind of spiral scroll on two faces, front and back, and the volutes are connected by horizontal, straight and curved lines. The architrave is divided into two fasci. The frieze is usually plain. The cornice is supported by an ogee and other enriched mouldings. The cornice itself consists of a corona, with a small ogee and fillet on which is placed a chyma recta. The general proportions of the Corinthian and Composite columns are the same, and they differ only in their mouldings and enrichments. The base of both is occasionally Attic. The flutings of the shaft are the same as the Ionic. The capital of the Corinthian is composed of 2 rows of acanthus leaves, 8 in each row, and the upper row is placed between and over the divisions of the lower row. 4 spiral volutes in each face rise out of 2 bunches of the acanthus leaf, and 2 of these on each fascia are connected at the angles and support the abacus. The frieze is enriched with figures or ornaments. The cornice is distinguished by its modillions and dentils. The former are supported by an enriched echinus and astragal, and the latter by an ogee and astragal enriched. Richness of decoration distinguishes both these orders. The composite, as its name implies, is a compound. The chief difference between it and the Corinthian is that the volutes have the characteristic of the Ionic order. The General Post Office, London, erected from the designs of Sir Robert Smirke, is a correct copy of the Attic Ionic order, Grecian Doric. Of the remains of this style may be noticed the ponderous ruins at Selinus in Sicily, which consist of no less than 6 temples, one of which, 331 feet in length, composed of a double peristyle of columns 60 feet high, must have presented one of the sublimest objects ever reared by human art. At Agrigentum, also in Sicily, are the ruins of the Temple of Juno, most picturesque now, and of Concord, most perfect. There are also the ruins of the Grand Temple of Olympian Jove, one of the most stupendous buildings of the ancient world, and whose buried materials swell into hills or subside into valleys so as to make the traveler ignorant whether he tread upon the prostrate labors of man or the workings of nature. There is also at Gela the Temple of Apollo. It is found that all these enormous piles arose in little more than a century, embracing the greater part of the 5th and early part of the 4th century before our present era. Of the Temple of Minerva or Parthenon at Athens, erected about 450 BC, we may form some judgment by the remains now in the British Museum and a model reduced in its perfect state. It was built under the direction of Phidias by Ictinus, to whom also is ascribed the most perfect vestige of antiquity in existence, the Temple of Apollo Epicurus in Arcadia, and which is reported to have been one of the most splendid buildings of the Peloponnesus. The magnificent columns which crown Sunium's marble steep, ruins of the Temple of Minerva, belong to the same era. The propylaeum of Grecian Doric, on an imposing scale, erected by Brother Hardwick at the railway terminus Euston Square, is the grandest architectural specimen in England. Its model was the entrance to the marketplace at Athens. Ionic order. There are but few remains of the order now extant in Greece or her colonies, but we may notice the Temple of Juno in the Isle of Samos, raised about 8 centuries before the present era, and which, in the age of Herodotus, was the grandest building in Greece. The earliest example of the true Ionic was the Temple of Bacchus at Teos, erected about 440 BC. At Athens are the remains of the temples of Minerva Polias and Erechtheus of unknown date. Near Miletus in Ionia is the Temple of Apollo. At Priene, another city of Ionia, is a Temple of Minerva. In other parts of Asia, Minor also are remains of this order, the names and dates of which cannot be ascertained. St. Pancras Church, London, erected about 1819, is worthy of notice as the finest copy of Erechtheum Ionic, Corinthian order. The earliest building of this order is the magnificent Temple of Minerva at Tegea in the Peloponnesus, of which Scopas was the architect. It was erected about 400 BC. The circular erection of Lysicrates, called the Choragic Monument, is one of the most exquisite and perfect gems of architectural taste, and the purest specimen of the order which has reached our time. Its minuteness and unobtrusive beauty has preserved it almost entire amid the ruin of the mightiest piles of Athenian art. It was erected 342 BC, also may be noticed at Athens the magnificent ruins of the temple of the Olympian Jupiter, the columns of which are of the best age of Greece. They are composed of the finest white marble and of the most perfect workmanship, with an elevation of nearly 60 feet, and belong to an edifice 400 feet long. Originally there were but 3 orders, all of Grecian origin: the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. They exhibit 3 essentially distinct styles of composition, and they alone show invention and particular character. To these the Romans added the Tuscan, which they made plainer than the Doric, and the Composite, which was more ornamental than the Corinthian. As now classed, the 5 orders are the Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and Composite. The Tuscan is the most simple and solid and is placed first in order on account of its plainness. Its column is 7 diameters high. The base, capital, and entablature have but few moldings. The simplicity of the construction of this column renders it eligible where solidity is the chief object, and where ornament would be superfluous. It may be said to be no other than the Doric, more deprived of ornament. The Doric, although of the earliest date, is placed second. Its column, agreeably to modern proportions, is 8 diameters high and has no ornament except mouldings on either base or capital, though the frieze is distinguished by triglyphs and mitopes and the cornice by mutules. The solid composition of this order gives it a preference in structures where strength and a noble but rough simplicity are chiefly required. The Ionic bears a kind of mean proportion between the more solid and delicate orders. Its column is 9 diameters high. Its capital is adorned with volutes, a kind of spiral scroll, and, which is the characteristic ornament of the order, its cornice has denticles. There is both delicacy and ingenuity displayed in this column, and when pure it is indeed most elegant. It is poetically suggested to have been formed after the model of a young female of elegant shape with her hair dressed, as a contrast to the Doric order, which was formed after that of a strong, robust man. The Corinthian, the richest of the 5 orders, is generally considered to be a masterpiece of art, and its invention attributed to the poet Callimachus in the following anecdote, which, if not true, is too pretty to be thrown aside. He observed on the grave of a young lady recently interred a basket of toys, left as a tribute by her nurse, perhaps as a votive offering of affection, covered with a tile placed over an acanthus, a herb with broad prickly leaves. As the plant grew, the leaves encompassed the basket, till arriving at the tile they met with an obstruction and bent downwards. Callimachus struck with the object, and he made a drawing of it. The base of the capital he made to represent the basket, the abacus the tile, and the volutes the bended leaves. It is Vitruvius who tells this pretty traditional story, but the plant was always a favorite with the poets. Theocritus, describing a cup of Aetolian manufacture, says, "The plant acanthus is expanded all round the cup and represents a vase of bronze covered with acanthus leaves wrought in gold." Virgil mentions the plant in several places, and in the Bucolics describes 2 beechen cups, on which was carved the scene of Orpheus enchanting the trees, with the soft acanthus folded round the handles. The frieze of the Corinthian capital is covered with ornamental devices, and the cornice with dentils and modillions. There is something stately in this column. The composite, as its name imports, is compounded of the other orders. Its capital has 2 rows of the acanthus leaves of the Corinthian and the volutes of the Ionic order. The column is 10 diameters high, and its cornice has dentils and simple modillions. This style is adapted for buildings where strength, elegance, and beauty are sought for. Painting and sculpture strained every nerve to decorate the buildings fair science had raised, while the curious hand designed the furniture and tapestry. Music, eloquence, and poetry lent their aid, beautifying and adorning them with temperance, fortitude, justice, virtue, honor, and mercy, beside many other Masonic emblems. The splendor, however, of all was eclipsed by the double triangle on which were exhibited faith, hope, and charity, united with brotherly love, relief, and truth. Relative proportions of the 5 orders. The distinction of order belongs, strictly speaking, to the style of the column and external part of the building. Although in ecclesiastical structures the roof has also the support of arches, they are not always supported by columns of any marked character. A style of architecture which does not belong exclusively to either of the 5 orders has obtained so much notoriety in our own days that for the claim we now set forth, it must not be omitted in a work devoted to Freemasonry. This style, which has the various appellations of Gothic, pointed, or Christian, is marked by the full development and consistent application of the pointed arch. During the 12th century first appeared an innovation of the rounded or circular arch by the introduction of the lancet, or sharply pointed. And as several churches were erected almost simultaneously, no authority we have consulted awards to anyone a priority of date. Hence it has been a matter of dispute among writers on the subject of architecture as to whence this style was derived. Walpole claims it as English, as its first adoption was in the cathedrals of our own land, and it is difficult to displace this claim, but he offers no suggestion as to who the builders were. Lord Aberdeen maintains that the style is of Oriental growth, and that it was brought in by the Crusaders. Sir Christopher Wren thinks it was invented by the Society of Freemasons, who travelled throughout Europe, erecting churches. Now, had either of these commentators reviewed the entire subject impartially, he would necessarily have seen his opponent's views were equally correct as his own. And if we allow that the first examples were in England, that the designers derived the idea from something they had seen in the East during the Holy Wars, and that those architects were members of the religious and military orders, we think the conclusion we shall arrive at is that Sir Christopher Wren's theory is the true one. The Freemasons invented the style in question. We have undoubted evidence that the Abbey Church of Saint-Ouen in Rouen, which may claim preeminence for lightness and elegance over every other structure, was designed by Alexander de Berneval, the Freemason. He began the building in the early part of the 12th century and died when the building had only advanced as far as the transept. Berneval intended, it appears, to flank the western front by two magnificent towers, ending by a combination of open arches and tracery corresponding with the outline and fashion of the central tower. Peterborough is the only English cathedral possessing this feature, which adds greatly to the magnificence of the building. The Crusaders, in visiting Constantinople, must have gazed with wonder at the magnificence displayed in the buildings, as before it was despoiled by successive Vandals. We do not refer to the barbarians so-called, but the Venetians as well as the Turks. Many of the glorious structures of Asia Minor, of which now only ruined fragments remain, were in some state of completeness, if not perfect. Some vestiges of the fortresses erected by the Templars and Hospitallers are now in existence in the Holy Land, which have defied the hand of time as they did the Turks. The Church of the Templars in London, as also some few others in our own land, remain to testify the architectural skill of the soldier monks. There are also in Britain remains of a like disposition to erect stately structures in the Hospitallers. And at Marienburg and Thorn in Prussia, the Teutonic Knights have left permanent records of their capabilities as builders, by whatever name it is designated. This system of architecture was perfected and diffused all over Europe within a comparatively brief space of time by a small society of artists who were closely connected with each other. But whoever might be the builders, this much is certain, that they were not mere heapers together of stones, but they all had thoughts which they meant to embody in their labors. Let a building be ever so beautiful, if it be destitute of meaning, it cannot belong to the fine arts. The proper display of purpose, the immediate expression of feeling, are indeed denied to this eldest and most sublime of all the arts. It must excite the feelings through the medium of thought, but perhaps the feelings which it does excite are on that account only so much the more powerful. All architecture is symbolical, but none so much as the Christian architecture of the Middle Ages. The first and greatest of its objects is to express the elevation of holy thoughts, the loftiness of meditation set free from earth and proceeding unfettered to heaven. It is this which stamps itself on the spirit of the beholder, however little he may himself be capable of analyzing his feelings when he gazes on those far-stretching columns and airy domes. But this is notable. Every part of the structure is as symbolical as the whole, and of this we can perceive many traces in the writings of the times. The altar is directed towards the rising of the sun, and the three great entrances are meant to express the conflux of visitors from all the regions of the earth. Three towers express the Christian mystery of the triune Godhead. The choir rises like a temple within a temple with redoubled loftiness. The shape of the cross is in common with the Christian churches, even of the earlier times. The round arch was adopted in the earlier Christian architecture, but laid aside on account of the superior gracefulness, supposed to result from the crossing of arches. The rose is the most essential part of all the ornaments of this architecture. Even the shape of the windows, doors, and towers may be traced to it, as well as the accompanying decorations of flowers and leaves. When we view the whole structure from the crypt to the choir, it is impossible to resist the idea of earthly death, leading only to the fullness, the freedom, and the solemn glories of eternity. A writer in The Builder, in referring to the oriental source of Western architecture, says, "I remember once standing before the magnificent front of Peterborough Cathedral with an old Indian officer when he said, 'Why, this is just what we see throughout the East. Huge pointed portals running up to the top of the building, spires, pinnacles, everything like the minarets.' the aspiring character of Mussulman architecture, and this style came into general use shortly after the Great Crusade. We do not say that the dogma, post hoc ergo propter hoc, is always correct, but surely it is in this instance. While noticing the various styles of architecture, it may not be out of place to refer to what may be considered the oldest in existence, the pyramidal, and as belonging to that character, Mr. Ferguson in his Handbook of Architecture says, "Whatever value may be placed upon the Buddhist monuments as works of art, there can be no question of their historical value. Of the styles still practiced, it is the oldest, having been constantly in use for more than 2,000 years. And it is the style of a religion which even now, when its greatest glory has passed away, still reckons among its votaries, if not the greatest, at least as great a number of followers as any religion that exists on the face of the globe. Of Masonic symbols, we may notice one on the front of the tomb of Solon at Dagonlu. Solon flourished 600 years BC. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.